on back here? Yeah. This over here at this point?
Yep, it's right there. Ready? Here we go. And action.
I find that so extremely offensive, and the only word you can say to the manufacturers and the shareholders of the company is shame on you. Shame, shame, shame on you.
Mark, hold it right there.
Shame on people that produce that trash. It's child abuse, in my judgment.
I don't like it at all.
Mark.
About 2 months ago, I saw the video game Night Trap for the first time. It is a sick, disgusting video game, in my judgment.
There's the drill. That's the guy with the drill.
Yeah, that is the guy with the drill.
We mustn't catch him or we don't see the gratuitous violence.
It's an effort to trap and kill women.
For the first month or so, I would see Tom and I would say, there is the evil man that made Night Trap. And he'd say, there is the evil man that made Night Trap. But it was a joke for a while. Then the joke started getting serious until a friend of my family's called me and said, hey, did you know Captain Kangaroo came on TV today and said that Night Trap was a bad game?
The danger arises when the subject of the software is of a violent nature.
And that's where it got very serious for me, because I loved Captain Kangaroo.
Well, I mean, God, it was on the front page of USA Today, it was on the front page of the Washington Post, it was on the front page of the New York Times. It was so new, it was so revolutionary at the time that it first came out, that it was ideal fodder for somebody who wanted to use it as a political hand grenade.
Your bullets can't hurt me.
And when we see the new generation of video games, and especially Night Trap and several other examples, in my judgment, they've gone too far.
You're the only one that can save me.
My son and I, Tyler, who's 11 now, we went to rent a movie. And the gentleman said to me, he says, hey, you know, Dana, they took your game off the market. And I said, what? Why? He said, well, obviously there's a bunch of controversy behind it. And I said, oh, really? And that's how I heard. It's not violent, you know, in any sense. It's not violent, it's not gory, it's not anything like that at all. And the object of the game is to save the girls that go in for the slumber party.
Way to go, Control. I knew you could do it.
Our state of mind about creating some horrible, frightening thing.
So, you're the troublemaker.
It was really, how many Augs can we trap in the house?
The guy from the New York Times called me and he said, we hear these terrible things are happening. That was like one of the first phone calls I got, that these games are really violent and people, you know, are really up in arms about them. And I was saying, have you seen Night Trap?
Oh, they're the Augs, by God.
Evil Augs.
They are evil. You can just tell by the way they're hopping along.
I'm afraid the Augs aren't our biggest problem.
The horrible sex and violence scene is in the bathroom. Right here, X marks the spot. This is where Lisa gets it. She is in a nightgown, so I guess this is the scantily clad part. And there's, you know, an Aug in the shower. I mean, it was funny. You could hear people laughing on the set because it is.
I don't see why it would be titillating. I had on a spaghetti strap nightgown. It was cute. It was peach. I think it had little flowers here.
The whole sort of reason for having that thing that goes around the neck of the kids that get nailed was to make it something that was sort of so phantasaical and something so non-replicable that there wouldn't be any chance that anybody could mistake it for reality.
Ooh, so scary.
A controversial scene.
This is actually the reason why there's ratings on video games now.
We prefer self-regulation to government regulation, but make no mistake about it, we will move ahead if you do not.
The one good thing that came from Night Trap is that it created a rating system for titles.
I flew to Washington to go to these hearings. In the morning of the hearings, they announced to us, they told me, gee, you know, we're really sorry. Thanks so much for coming. We're really sorry, but we decided that there isn't any time to hear your testimony today. And then at some point in the hearings, Dorgan is reading from, he says, yeah, and it's a shame Mr. Zito couldn't be here to defend this horrible filth that this company is putting out. I said, Senator, I am here and I'd be happy to talk about it. You're out of order. Just, be quiet back there.
See, these people are crazy.
That I actually did see TV reports that the object of the game was to kill and rape sexy co-eds.
There was absolutely no sex.
Sex? I mean, unless you're attracted to large, dark objects that go like this, there wasn't any.
Wait.
Hey,
Actually,
you see where she just bumped into? Good Lord. It's gratuitous, the sex.
At the end of the hearings, I walked up to Lieberman and I said to him, Senator, have you ever actually played this game? And he said, I don't have to. This is filth.
And I think that Night Trap was kind of thrown to the wolves as bait. Like, here, have this one.
I want to state that Night Trap will never appear on a Nintendo system. Obviously, it would not pass our guidelines.
You know, when all this TV coverage was going on, I was on a TV show, and when I needed the Night Trap footage, it was Nintendo that was like, oh, we'll send it to you.
Howard, I owe all the sales of Night Trap to you.
Want to sell something to 16-year-old boys? Get it banned by Toys R Us. You can't keep enough of a supply at the warehouse.
I've had some controversy in my life, and I just found it interesting that there was some controversy behind this also. But it's like this dark cloud, that just kind of follows me.
I have this horrible feeling that 20 years from now, somebody's going to call me and say, Jim, we want to do an interview, and I'm going to say, great, is it Wirehead? Is it this new show? And no, Night Trap, the classic, the great, we want to get the behind the scenes of Night Trap. I'm going to be pulling this stupid binder out, every 5 years going, yeah, well, we had a lot of fun.
Thanks.
Mark. Rick, will you tell these guys to stop bugging me?
My name is Jim Riley, and I was co-creator, writer, and director on Night Trap. This is mid-'80s. Nintendo is doing very well with their video games, right? Mario Brothers type stuff. Sega is doing pretty well. I was working with Nolan Bushnell on a series of interactive advertising and interactive retailing campaigns. And I got a call from a guy who was actually my neighbor, Rob Fulop, who had developed Demon Attack and a number of Atari games. And he knew of a guy named Tom Zito working at another Nolan Bushnell company that had actually been presented. There was a guy, an engineer, who came in with this wafer that allowed you to attach it to a VCR and be able to interact with the video cartridge as your video source, but you could interact up to 4 choices at any one time. And they were trying to figure out what to do with it. So Rob knew that I had a background in live action interactive and introduced me to Tom. Tom wanted to put together some demos to take to Hasbro. And they said, so this is a relatively inexpensive addition to a VCR. And if we provide this enhancement, we can actually get into the video game business and allow us to compete. That's significant revenue. And now we're in the living room. We all came up with ideas, and my focus was more about these environments where you could go anywhere at any time or feel as if you could move more freely. One of the easiest ways to think of that is surveillance cameras. The first demo we did was Scene of the Crime to kind of play test the idea of being able to move around through surveillance cameras and see how interesting that was. So in Scene of the Crime, the basic idea is that this wealthy man has a safe full of money in his library, and he has this new surveillance system where you, the participant, is the security guy. And he tells you to please watch the safe, and if anybody tries to break in, he wants to know about it.
Watch them with the cameras. If anyone tries anything, I want to know about it.
Then you can move around the house, switching cameras, to try to follow what's going on. Of course, everybody has a plot to steal the money. So you're trying to figure out who's involved, how it happens, and then after a 3 to 5 minute quick period, sure enough, somebody stole the money. The lights were out. It was hard to tell exactly who it was. You couldn't just sit in the room to figure it out. And then he says, okay, who did it? And then you guess. So really simple concept, but 4 of us flew back to Hasbro, pitched it to Stephen Hasenfeld and a boardroom of 22 executives. That day we got funding, significant funding, to start what became Digital Pictures. Then they said, okay, we want to do a title that uses this. And at that point, I was working on a number of other things, but I felt like surveillance cameras is great, but to have more effect on what happens, rather than just an observer looking at what's going on, if we could create some device that allowed participants to feel more engaged and be able to subtly change the story. Again, not branching or changing the ending, but in fact, be able to do something and watch how the story changes. And have to play it multiple times to really understand the subtleties of that. And that was the traps, which could be done even within this very limited environment. What happened, though, was, everybody started to realize, wow, this is tricky stuff. Part of it is that there was never a real formula. Hasbro decided that it didn't want to move forward. They began, I think, to understand that this is a significant investment. This is like starting a studio. We all went away, 1989, and then in 1992, Tom negotiated a deal with Sega, who had come up with the Sega CD, which was just powerful enough to stream. Back then, it's Donkey Kong, it's Mario Brothers, really simple pixelated graphics. And so all of a sudden, there was this option to play or experience a live-action interactive world that was all photoreal with real people, et cetera. So that I think was the initial excitement. And so when the Sega CD came out, everybody was just hats and horns, and this is fantastic, and look, we can interact with this. And we had a number of really interesting people that were experimenting, is really the best way to say it, with this sort of new platform. Not quite sure what it was. And everything from writers who were, having constructive arguments about interactive narrative, which is very tricky, right? A lot of people will say, we don't want people to look the wrong way or we want to control their experience and to give this to novice or non-filmmakers, it goes against everything that they've been trained to do. The other side of that is the game, is a video game. And a video game, a really good video game, is you have full control. You're actually, the world is very believable, full of fascinating characters, and you're motivated to do a number of things to achieve whatever the goal is. But it's a high level of interactivity, right? And that's more important than the believability of your environment, right? So those are the two extremes. Even back then, those were the two extremes. But there was this funny gray area, and nobody quite knew what to make of it. You know, we called it FMV or live action interactive or whatever those things were. We'd bring in a writer, a director, a game designer, a software programmer. There were all these different people sitting around a table speaking completely different languages, having very different sensibilities, trying to find some common ground. The first concept was to take the sort of wealthy guy and, you know, with a safe full of money to the extreme. So it was a billionaire who had, you know, Fort Knox in his house, modern house in Lake Tahoe. He was able to do this with comfort and leave knowing that he had this next generation security system, which included the latest surveillance cameras and also these traps and gadgets that would allow the 24/7 security team to be able to trap any potential intruders. And so happens one weekend, his daughter shows up for a slumber party with all of her teenage friends, and the house is attacked by ninja burglars. And the reason I thought ninjas would be the cool approach would be that they move in the shadows. You start off with this really simple, clean concept that, you know, could be refined and really have an edge to it and a look and stuff, and you end up with this thing that is a combination of bad notes over time. And somehow it went from ninjas focused on getting the money, you know, and the girls being able to, you know, they were sort of not the key, but they were very much caught in the mix, to vampires. There was this thing called reproducible violence. It's the first time I had heard that term, but it turns out to be a very real thing. And Hasbro in particular was very concerned about that. So we went into kind of the supernatural realm with the vampire. And they said, no, we don't want to see, you know, vampires biting the girls. So these were toothless vampires, and they could not move too quickly. So they actually had to be kind of sick. So they had to be toothless, sick vampires. I mean, it just kept getting worse. And the AUG term came because they really needed blood, and the only way they could get it was to auger in with a device like the trocar. That cleared as a non-reproducible violence. I thought that in our effort to homogenize this thing and make it more friendly and less scary, it actually was pretty creepy in terms of these, you know, strange characters walking around with the trocar. In this case, the script writing was so bizarre because you had to do two things. You had to create a world, then you had to navigate within that world. You had technical limits of what you could actually do, but you were cheating that to make it look like you could do anything. So that was a whole thing. And then for the moments, you could write a scene, but the scene had to motivate somebody to go somewhere else. But the script was not 120 pages. The script was like this, right, with a timeline there. And people were going, how do I read this? I mean, you know, it's kind of like, you know, I'm here and what, because everything was, by the way, time, right? Because you only had that much time for the scene. So blocking was very different rather than sitting down with the actors and saying, what's the intent here, and should you walk over here, and where should you? It was like, okay, we got you have 24 seconds. So how do we block this where you're going to end up going out that door, but it's got to look natural, right? Yeah. And you got to be out that door in 18 seconds, because in 18 seconds you're going to appear in the hallway. I walked around with a timeline. I think it became sort of a joke, which is, where are we now? And I'd have to take the timeline out, and it had 8 tracks, right? 4 at any one time with stills. And I would be able to figure out. So it was tricky that we shot days and nights, sets and locations. I was surprised at how quickly everybody got into it. Right? It wasn't difficult for them to go, oh, I get it. Okay, so, I'm going to be here, but I could be over there, and then depending on what happens with the AUG here, I might, and they got into it. And in some cases, they adjusted their performance accordingly, which was a wonderful surprise. We didn't have a lot of money to cast name talent and that sort of thing. Dana Plato was someone who we were lucky to get.
Well, there's something about Kelly.
Woman's intuition again, huh?
Oh, Victor, you monster. Come on, let's go. We don't want to upset the augers.
All the AUGs were stunt guys with, trash bags taped to them. But when the trap went, they had to be in a position where they were balanced, right? Because when they drop through the floor, they've got to be able to do it. How do you move? You do this. So that became the AUG walk. We had to figure out in the shooting how to be most economical. So we generally shot out each environment. The bedroom was one of the first sets we shot, and the lobby or the foyer was one of the last. But most of the continuity, there were so many other issues that continuity like that was the least of anybody's concern.
This guy is really leaked out.
Trying to create an environment where the cast, and to some degree the DP and the lighting guys, really could participate as if they were making a movie. There were other technical restrictions. They were very nervous about things that were too dark. I mean, the way it was originally envisioned was that it was really cool and edgy. And it turned out to be super bright because they were concerned that if it got too dark, that it would pixelate too much. Because the technology was so new and we were right at the edge. What was interesting is we shot Night Trap on 35 millimeter. In fact, Don Burgess was the DP and went on to do Forrest Gump, and not that Night Trap launched his career. I mean, Don Burgess, this brilliant DP, is having to essentially light the room like everything's got neon lights. And we were all unhappy about that. But at the same time, it's the first time it's being done, right? And there were a lot of people involved, and everybody was making their best guess. The shoot was tricky. We shot days and nights, sets and locations. The post was very tricky. I ended up using, I think it was Ediflex at one pass. It was the only way to cut this, because what you end up with, it's a puzzle, right? So think of it as, a 3D chess game where you're trying to figure out, okay, I got a little piece right there, and I got a piece that ties into that. In spite of all of this, it was a title that became very popular with a lot of people, I think primarily because it was one of the first to have real characters, in a real photoreal world.
Sarah, we're in this huge house with all your friends. We have telephones, we have a car, your parents are gone, and you say so?
Come on, Sarah, what's the first thing you think of?
Party!
We had gone through a 3-year period with Hasbro where we looked at the marketplace, we did a ton of play testing, and I don't think it was ever clearly resolved what this thing was. And in fact, when it was ported over to Sega CD, I felt more concerned. Yes, it was being released, but it was being released on a game platform. And sure enough, everybody was going, well, this isn't really a game. I mean, this is an interesting thing and it's fun. And for a lot of people, they didn't need a heavy interaction. So the live action, real characters was more interesting, at least for a period of time. Night Trap goes out, and still a new market. Nobody quite knows what's going on, and I don't think the sales were that great. And then all of a sudden, there's a Senate hearing on violence in video games. And Night Trap is one of the premier, and I'm just thinking, you're kidding. I mean, because by that time, we had homogenized it down to the simplest things. The only thing that was probably the most violent was the trocar in the bathroom scene.
Megan, this isn't gonna work. You're not scaring me. Wait, what are you doing now?
If you saw the Senate hearing, what it looked like is somebody had just edited out the most violent things from different games, including Night Trap, and put it together and showed it to these guys who, of course, most likely never played video games, so they didn't really understand the market. But what they thought is, my 8-year-old kid is being trained to kill people. If you talk to the kid, he'd go, what are you talking about? This is like not a big deal. So I think what happened is there were selects that were made, including the trocar scene in the bathroom of Night Trap. They said, not only is this violence, not only are you promoting violence to our kids and somehow subconsciously turning them into, violent criminals, but because it's real, it's actually more scary. Up till that time, it was pixelated graphics. And when it became real, I think everybody thought, oh my God, now this is really bad. I don't think there was a lot of understanding of what was going on in the business. I don't think that Night Trap, in comparison to some of the other games that were out at that time, was that violent. It did have its moments, and when you, just like anything, once you take those things and you put them together, you can make anything look like the worst horror film you've ever seen. But thank God, because two things happened. One is sales of Night Trap just went through the roof, and then they came up with the rating system. The irony is that Night Trap is still on the list of most violent games. And you look at what's out there, I mean, there's no comparison. The shower scene, it's not even a shower scene, but the bathroom scene with the trocar, it looks pretty gruesome when you do the close-up and you see the drill going into the neck, and I get that. At least back then it was, considered to be pretty gruesome. But, for some people, you have to look at the OGs as kind of sad. What's happening now is it's worth bringing back Night Trap and some other things just because there are a lot of people that would love to see it in better resolution, and I don't know where the film is. I mean, fortunately, I made a copy of the original timed masters, and those were, again, timed for this unknown world. So everything's bright but even then, you're going to see a lot more contrast and a lot more detail than you did through the Sega CD. I'm hoping that the fans of the game will actually have a newer, fresher experience with the resolution change. I'm also very interested in people that have never been in this world before and don't think of it as a game, and don't think of it as a movie, but think of it as live-action interactive. Today, you say interactive, and it's like, yeah, so what? What specifically do you mean? Your computer's interactive, right? So back then, it was people didn't understand when you said interactive. They really didn't know what that meant. Or they'd have very different ideas about what that meant. So in some ways, that part of it, I think is going to be fun.